Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling the evolution of human language.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a topic you guys have been pretty curious about for a while, and you even sent over some excerpts from a paper called Natural Language and Natural Selection by Steven Pinker and Paul Bloomh.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Yeah, and we're going to jump right into a pretty big debate right off the bat. Does language evolve through natural selection, or did it just kind of emerge as like a byproduct of something else?
Right, so like a happy little accident.
Exactly.
Well, Pinker and Bloomh, they're firmly in the natural selection camp. They argue that language, with all its complexity, shows signs of being like designed for a specific purpose, much like the human eye is very clearly designed for sight.
Okay, so they're not buying the whole happy accident theory of language development.
Not at all. To illustrate their point, they compare language to something like a complex piece of technology, let's say like a television. You wouldn't just find a TV line around and then assume that it just like spontaneously developed the ability to receive broadcasts, right?
Right.
The engineering is just way too intricate.
Yeah, it has to have been designed by someone for that specific purpose.
Exactly. And that's essentially what Pinker and Bloomh are saying about language. They're saying it's so sophisticated, so perfectly suited for communication that it points to some kind of design process, which in this case would be natural selection.
It is pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is.
We use words and sentences every day without, too much effort.
Right.
But underneath it all is this incredibly complex system of rules and structures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the paper actually delves into some specific examples of these like design features of language.
Oh, okay.
Like take, for instance, the way that we categorize words into nouns, verbs, adjectives, and so on.
Right.
This seemingly simple system actually allows us to communicate incredibly efficiently.
Yeah.
Then there's the structure of sentences, whether it's word order or even like specific markings on words. It's like we have this universal code for conveying who did what to whom.
And we can even talk about events that happened in the past or will happen in the future.
Exactly.
We can express time through language, even without, clocks. Then there are those little words that we kind of take for granted, like pronouns.
That's right.
Which just save us from constantly repeating ourselves.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Did all of this really just come together by chance?
Well, that's where you get into the whole just so story criticism.
Ah, okay.
Some people argue that adaptationists, like Pinker and Bloomh, are just kind of inventing convenient narratives after the fact.
Oh, I see.
But Pinker and Bloomh, they counter this argument by emphasizing just how complex language actually is.
Yeah.
Going back to the TV analogy, they argue that language isn't like, say, a nose that just happens to be useful for holding up spectacles.
Okay, so they're saying that language, much like a TV, is a highly specialized tool that has been built for a very specific purpose, which is to communicate these complex ideas.
Exactly.
Okay.
But then there's another challenge to the design argument: the sheer diversity of human languages.
Yeah, that's always been a bit of a head scratcher for me. If language is a product of this meticulous design process, like, why are there so many different versions of it? It almost feels like a contradiction.
It's a natural question to ask, but Pinker and Bloomh, they actually highlight that despite these surface-level variations, all languages share deep underlying similarities.
Okay.
It's kind of like they may sound and look very different,
Yeah.
but at their core, they're all running on the same basic mental software.
Oh, okay. So it's like they're all different models of the same car, right?
I think so.
So like they might have different features, but under the hood, it's the same engine.
Perfect analogy. They even give specific examples in the paper, like contrasting English with completely different languages like Warlpiri or Cherokee.
Oh, wow.
And they demonstrate how, despite the obvious differences, these languages ultimately use the same underlying mental machinery.
That's fascinating.
And they even bring up Chomsky's famous observation that anything you find in one language you can find in another, maybe just at a more abstract level.
So are we saying that essentially we're all working from some kind of universal blueprint for language?
Exactly.
And then the differences that we see are just minor tweaks to that blueprint?
Precisely, like adjusting the settings on a complex machine.
It raises an interesting question, though. Why have more than one language at all? Why not just one universal language for everybody?
Right. That would make things a lot easier.
It would. It would.
Well, the paper offers a couple of compelling speculations.
Okay.
The first being, imagine the burden on our genes if we had to have an innate code for every single word in some massive global language.
Yeah.
It would be insanely inefficient.
It makes sense that a more flexible system would be better.
Right. A flexible system would allow for things like cultural innovation, right? Like, think about all the new words that are constantly being added to languages to accommodate new inventions and new ideas.
So some degree of language diversity is actually a good thing.
That's what Pinker and Bloomh seem to be suggesting. They also point out that some aspects of grammar might be more easily learned from the environment, which, of course, naturally leads to some variations across different communities.
Okay, but I have another question about this whole design concept.
Okay.
Some features of grammar just seem so arbitrary, even badly designed, like all those weird rules about what questions you can and can't ask, or like irregular verbs.
Right.
Why not just make everything regular?
Yeah.
It doesn't exactly scream intelligent design.
You've hit on another common criticism of this whole design argument.
Okay.
This is where Pinker and Bloomh introduced the concept of parity.
Parity, okay.
They explain that shared communication systems, whether we're talking about human language or something like computer protocols, they often rely on these conventions that seem totally arbitrary,
Right.
but they are standardized.
Yeah.
It's kind of like setting the parity on a printer and a computer. Yeah. It doesn't really matter which setting you choose as long as they match.
So maybe arbitrariness isn't actually a flaw in language.
Right.
It's a feature.
You got it. And this idea, it applies at all levels, from like the sounds we use for words to like complex grammatical rules.
Right.
Standardizing these seemingly arbitrary features through a universal grammar is actually much more efficient than having every single child try to independently invent a perfectly logical system from scratch.
Oh, can you imagine the chaos?
That would be a nightmare.
We'd never be able to understand each other.
Right.
But even if we accept all of this, there's still this question of like how such a complex system could have evolved gradually.
Right.
Wouldn't those intermediate stages of language have been completely useless? Like, how do you go from grunts to Shakespeare?
That's a key question, and it's where this concept of the Baldwin effect comes in.
The Baldwin effect.
Yeah.
Okay.
This idea basically suggests that learned behaviors can actually create a selection pressure for those behaviors to become instinctive over time.
So learning paves the way for instinct.
Exactly.
It's not just genes driving evolution, but it's our behaviors as well.
Yeah, exactly. And Pinker and Bloomh use a really great example to illustrate this.
Yeah.
Our ability to understand ungrammatical sentences.
Like cat jump table.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We use our general knowledge and context to decode that. But over time, selection might favor brains that process these kinds of sentences more automatically using grammar. What was once a learned ability then becomes more and more instinctive.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I still have one, like, lingering question.
Okay.
Did sophisticated grammar really give our early ancestors some kind of survival advantage? Like, it's hard to imagine them sitting around, you know, discussing the finer points of grammar while being chased by saber-toothed tigers.
You've stumbled upon what's often called pre-max challenge.
Yeah.
It's a totally valid point. But Pinker and Bloomh emphasize that it's really about those small, cumulative advantages over vast stretches of time.
So even if we can't pinpoint, you know, a specific advantage to say, like, adding an extra grammatical rule
Right.
over hundreds of thousands of years, those tiny advantages could have really added up to something significant.
Precisely.
Okay.
And these changes, you know, they're not always about adding new rules or features.
Okay.
Imagine the advantage of being able to say better, understand someone else's intentions, to predict their behavior. That kind of social intelligence would have been invaluable in the complex social world our ancestors inhabited.
It's like that saying, it's not about the cards you're dealt, but how you play them.
Right.
Early humans who were better at playing the social game, so to speak, would have had a significant advantage.
Absolutely. And language would have been the key tool for playing that game.
Right.
The better your language skills, the more effectively you could communicate, persuade, and even maybe deceive.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the technical aspects of language, like grammar rules, but we can't forget about all the social functions of language as well.
Absolutely. And as social complexity increased, the pressure to develop more sophisticated language skills would have increased as well.
Okay.
So there's this constant interplay between social pressure and cognitive evolution.
Right.
That's what makes the emergence of language so fascinating.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a moment and just kind of recap what we've covered so far.
Okay.
We've seen how language shows signs of being designed for a specific purpose. How this whole diversity of languages doesn't actually contradict that idea.
Right.
And how even small selective advantages, especially in terms of like social intelligence, could have led to the development of this incredible system.
Exactly.
But as with any good deep dive, we've also uncovered probably more questions than answers.
Right.
Perhaps the most intriguing one is this. If language evolved as this like powerful tool for social navigation, as Pinker and Bloomh argue, how is that shaping our interactions today?
That's a great question. And it might be a good place to pause for now.
Okay.
And pick up this thread in part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay, that sounds great. We'll take a short break, and then we'll be right back with more on the evolution of human language.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing this idea of a cognitive arms race driving the evolution of language.
Oh, yeah.
It really makes you wonder if we're still caught up in this arms race, just with different weapons now.
For sure.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the paper for a second.
Okay.
And address the question of like the evolutionary timeline.
Right.
How could something as complex as language evolve within the time frame available?
Yeah, that's a big question that a lot of people have.
It's true. Sometimes the vastness of evolutionary time is kind of hard to wrap your head around.
It is.
So Pinker and Bloomh, they acknowledge this and emphasize that, even though it feels like this massive leap from, no language to complex language.
It's really about small changes accumulating over these long, long periods of time.
Right. They actually give the example of Haldane's calculations.
Okay.
Which show that even a tiny advantage, like a 1% difference in survival or reproductive success, can spread incredibly rapidly throughout a population over generations.
So even if we can't quite imagine what advantage, say, a slightly more complex grammatical structure would provide, that doesn't mean there wasn't one.
Right, exactly.
We just might not be able to see it from our perspective.
Yeah, and these changes aren't always even about like adding new rules or features, right?
Okay.
Imagine the advantage of being able to, say, better understand someone else's intentions to predict their behavior.
Right.
That kind of social intelligence would have been invaluable in the complex social world our ancestors lived in.
It's like that saying, it's not about the cards you're dealt, but how you play them.
Exactly.
Early humans who were better at kind of playing the social game, so to speak,
would have had a significant advantage.
Absolutely. And language would have been the key tool for playing that game.
Exactly.
The better your language skills, the more effectively you could communicate, persuade, and even maybe deceive.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in all the technical aspects of language, like grammar rules and things like that.
Right.
But we can't forget about all those social functions of language as well.
Absolutely. And as that social complexity increased, the pressure to develop more sophisticated language skills would have also increased, right?
Right, yeah.
So there's this constant interplay between social pressure and cognitive evolution.
Right, okay.
That's what makes the emergence of language so fascinating.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a moment and just kind of recap what we've covered so far.
Sure.
We've seen how language shows signs of being designed for a very specific purpose. How this diversity of languages that we see doesn't actually contradict that idea. And how even small selective advantages, especially in terms of like social intelligence, could have led to the development of this incredible system.
Exactly.
But as with any good deep dive, we've also probably uncovered more questions than answers.
Of course, yeah.
And maybe the most intriguing question is this. If language evolved as this really powerful tool for social navigation, as Pinker and Bloomh argue, how is that shaping our interactions today?
That's a really great question, and I think it might be a good place to move on to part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the evolution of human language. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's one point from the Pinker and Bloomh paper I kind of wanted to circle back to.
Okay.
It's about the sheer speed at which language seems to have evolved,
Oh, yeah, that's one of the most fascinating parts of it all. It really does seem like our brains, went into overdrive to accommodate this incredibly complex system.
Evolution is usually thought of as this, slow, gradual process. But with language, it almost seems like something different happened. Like evolution hit the fast forward button or something.
Yeah, Pinker and Bloomh definitely highlight how unusual this rapid development is.
Yeah.
They point out that in most cases, evolution works very slowly with these changes, accumulating gradually over these vast periods of time.
Right.
But language development seems to have been much more accelerated.
So what could explain this evolutionary speed boost? What were the driving forces?
Well, that's where that cognitive arms race idea comes back into play.
Right.
Remember, this idea suggests that competition for social advantage would have just created this intense pressure for cognitive evolution. So those individuals who were able to communicate more effectively, who were better at persuading, understanding others, and maybe even deceiving,
Right.
would have had a very distinct edge in this social landscape.
So it wasn't just about like language for survival in like a physical sense.
Right.
It was about using language to thrive in this really complex social environment.
Right.
It almost makes you wonder if those social instincts are still driving a lot of our communication today.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
And it's actually something that Pinker and Bloomh hint at in the paper.
Okay.
They suggest that these social uses of language might explain why our brains evolved so rapidly. Even if the benefits weren't immediately obvious for, physical survival.
Right.
It was about survival in a totally different arena.
Right.
The arena of social interaction, where words could be just as powerful or even more powerful than physical weapons.
It's kind of a sobering thought, isn't it?
It is.
This beautiful creative thing we call language might actually have its roots in a kind of social warfare.
Yeah. But it also makes you appreciate the incredible complexity of human nature, right?
So, absolutely.
And it definitely raises some pretty profound questions. If language evolved as a tool for, social maneuvering, how much of our modern communication is still driven by that ancient instinct?
Right. Are we all just like subtly trying to outsmart each other with our words, even in the most casual conversations? Do our best intentions sometimes carry these hidden agendas that are shaped by this evolutionary legacy?
Yeah.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think about.
It really is. It suggests that there's so much more going on beneath the surface of our everyday conversations than we might realize.
Yeah.
And, by understanding these deep evolutionary roots of language, we gain a whole new perspective on our own behavior and the hidden forces that shape our social world.
It's like we've uncovered this hidden operating system that's been running in the background of our interactions all along.
Yeah.
And once you become aware of it, you can't help but see its influence everywhere.
It's a journey of self-discovery, made possible by exploring these fascinating connections between these fields like evolutionary science and linguistics.
Yeah.
And as we've seen today, sometimes the most profound insights come from asking those unexpected questions.
Right.
And following that trail wherever it leads.
This deep dive has been truly eye-opening. We started with this seemingly simple question. How did language evolve? And we've ended up with a whole new perspective on, what it means to be human.
It has been an absolute pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
It's been great.
And I hope it sparked some new curiosity for our listeners about the just incredible power of language.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the evolution of human language. We hope you'll tune in again for our next exploration into the world of ideas.